The restaurant hummed with an air of exclusivity, the kind of place where even the quietest whispers felt like they were worth millions. Crystal chandeliers cast their glow across the polished mahogany tables, and the delicate clink of silverware created a rhythm that seemed almost choreographed. Christopher adjusted his cufflinks, his suit hugging his frame just as perfectly as the life he had carefully built. Tonight was pivotal. This deal could secure his company's reign over the market. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady yet warm, "this partnership is going to redefine everything." "Excuse me," a soft, trembling voice interrupted from the side of the table. Christopher paused, his gaze shifting to the source. A waitress stood there, balancing a tray of glasses, her head lowered as she waited for permission to serve. For a moment, he almost ignored her, but then she lifted her eyes. Time seemed to freeze. Christopher's breath caught as he locked eyes with a woman whose gaze was hauntingly familiar, yet utterly impossible. The tray in her hands wobbled, her knuckles whitening as she gripped it harder. Her face was a picture of shock and fear, like she had stepped into a moment she hadn't been prepared for. "Emma," he whispered, barely audible against the restaurant's clattering noise. The waitress blinked, her lips parted as if to speak, but instead, she quickly set the drinks down and turned, disappearing into the sea of diners. Christopher sat motionless, his mind racing. Couldn't be her. Emma was dead. Gone for 12 years in a tragic car crash that had torn his world apart. One of his associates, sensing something was off, broke the silence. "Is everything okay?" Christopher blinked, snapping back to reality. "Excuse me," he said abruptly, pushing his chair back and rising to his feet. His shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor as he navigated through the tables, his focus singular, finding her. The lavish surroundings faded into the background as he homed in on her face. He spotted her near the kitchen entrance, her back to him as she hurriedly removed her apron. "Emma," he called out, his voice more forceful this time. She flinched but didn't turn around. Instead, she tried to move away, but Christopher's long strides caught up with her quickly. Gently, he grabbed her arm, spinning her to face him. "It's you," he said, his voice low but intense. "I'm not imagining this. It's really you, Emma." The woman stared at him, her expression unreadable. She shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir. You must be mistaken." "Mistaken?" His disbelief morphed into a mix of frustration and desperation. "Don't do this. Don't lie to me. It's me, Christopher." Her eyes darted around, nervous, clearly uncomfortable with the attention they were drawing. "Please, I don't know who you think I am. I have to get back to work." "Emma, wait!" he called after her as she briskly walked toward a staff-only door, slipping through it before he could reach her. Christopher stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind. The resemblance was uncanny. It wasn't just her face, but the way she carried herself, the way she had looked at him, even for that split second. But if it really was her, how could she be alive? She had died over a decade ago. He returned to his table, but the business deal no longer held his attention. His associates exchanged worried glances, whispering among themselves, but Christopher didn't notice. The rest of the evening blurred by, and once he found an excuse, he left the restaurant. In the back of his sleek town car, he sat in silence as the city streets flashed by, the image of her face lingering in his mind. His thoughts were consumed with memories of the crash, the moment he had identified the wreckage, and the years of mourning that followed. But now those memories felt like a cruel joke. The car pulled up to his penthouse, where the floor-to-ceiling windows gave him a breathtaking view of the New York skyline. Yet, tonight, the city's lights brought no comfort. Standing by the window, he sipped from a glass of bourbon, his reflection staring back at him. "Emma," he whispered to himself, "what happened to you?" The question hung heavily in the air, unanswered and maddening. There was only one way to get answers. Tomorrow he would return to that restaurant and make her talk. He placed the glass down, determination solidifying in his expression. If Emma was truly alive, if there was even a chance she was telling the truth, he needed to know why. And he wouldn't leave until he had those answers. Christopher hardly slept that night. Every time his eyes closed, memories of Emma flooded his mind. Each one clearer, more vivid than the last. He could almost hear her laugh, see how her hair shimmered in the sunlight, and feel the warmth of her hand in his. It was as though his mind had opened a door that he thought was locked forever, and now the emotions poured in, impossible to contain. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the skyline, he was already dressed and sitting at his office. He had canceled all meetings for the day. Nothing mattered more than figuring out how Emma, the woman he had once loved, was alive and working as a waitress in New York. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. His assistant knocked lightly before entering. "Mr. Langston, you asked me to look into an employee at La Lumiere, the restaurant where you dined last night." Christopher nodded, his eyes fixed on the file she was holding. "I couldn't get much," she continued. "Her name is Emma Reed. She's been working there for about a year. There are no references or previous employment history listed, which is unusual. She keeps a very low profile." "Thank you, Maria," Christopher said, taking the file. "That will be all." As soon as the door closed behind her, he opened the file and stared at the photo attached to Emma's profile. It was recent, her face slightly older but unmistakably familiar. Her eyes seemed worn, carrying the weight of something far too heavy for one person to bear. He leaned back in his chair, clutching the photo. His mind wandered to the first time he met Emma. She had been the life of the party, her energy infectious, and her laughter lighting up every room she entered. They had been young and reckless, falling in love faster than either of them had anticipated. But then came the accident. The memory was still sharp like a knife. The phone call, the panic, the drive to the crash site. The wreckage had been barely recognizable. When the coroner confirmed Emma hadn't survived, it felt like the world had shattered around him. For years, he had carried the guilt of that night. If only he had been there with her. If only he had told her not to take that trip. He blamed himself even when everyone said it wasn't his fault. But now, after 12 years of grief, a new emotion had taken root. Anger. Anger at Emma, for disappearing, for letting him believe she was gone, for allowing him to mourn her. What kind of reason could justify such a betrayal? What kind of danger could have been so significant that she chose to vanish? Christopher couldn't shake the question. Driven by a need for answers, he made up his mind. He couldn't wait any longer. He grabbed his coat, heading straight for the door. Meanwhile, Emma sat in her small, sparsely furnished apartment, staring at a cup of coffee long gone cold. Her hands trembled slightly, though it was hard to say whether it was from lack of sleep or the fear that tightened around her chest. Seeing Christopher again had rattled her to the core. She had known this day might come. New York was vast, but it wasn't impossible for someone from her past to resurface, especially someone like Christopher Langston. Still, no amount of mental preparation could have prepared her for the reality of it. Her fingers brushed the edge of an old photo tucked away in a worn envelope on the table. It was the only thing she had held onto from her old life. A picture of her and Christopher, smiling on a beach during a weekend getaway. She had been careful not to keep it in view. Not after everything that had happened. Her mind drifted back to the accident. The flashing lights, the shattering glass, the gut-wrenching pain. She had woken up days later in a hospital room, far from home. Her body had been broken, her mind lost in a fog. It had taken months to recover physically, and even longer to piece together the fragments of her memory. Then the threats began. A shadowy figure had visited her in the hospital, telling her to disappear and stay away from Christopher, or else both their lives would be in danger. She didn't know why, but she believed him. The fear had been too powerful to question. Now, seeing Christopher again, all those old fears came rushing back. Could she trust him? Did he understand? Or would her presence only bring danger into his life once more? A sharp knock at the door startled her. Her heart raced. She stood frozen, unsure of what to do. "Emma," came Christopher's voice from the other side. Her stomach sank. She hadn't expected him to find her so quickly. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the door, but stopped just short of opening it. "Christopher, you shouldn't be here." she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not leaving until you talk to me, he replied, his tone firm. I need to know the truth. Emma rested her forehead against the door, her resolve crumbling. It's not that simple. Then make it simple, he insisted. You owe me that much. Tears welled up in her eyes. She had spent years building walls around her heart, but hearing his voice, the same blend of determination and vulnerability, made those walls begin to crack. Slowly, she unlocked the door, stepping back as it creaked open to reveal Christopher standing in the threshold. His gaze locked onto hers. Relief, frustration, and something deeper mixed in his expression. She couldn't place it. He stepped inside, his presence filling the small apartment, and gently closed the door behind him. She avoided his eyes, awkwardly gesturing toward the couch. You can sit. I'm not here to sit, Emma, Christopher said, his voice steady but low. I'm here for answers. Her fingers twisted together as she walked toward the kitchen, pretending to busy herself with the coffee mug she had abandoned earlier. There's nothing to explain, she murmured. Don't insult me, he snapped, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. You let me believe you were dead for 12 years. I grieved for you, Emma. His voice cracked, but he quickly regained control. I need to know why. The raw pain in his words made her chest tighten. She set the mug down with trembling hands, turning to face him. Do you really think I wanted this? She asked softly. Do you think it was easy for me to disappear, to leave everything behind? Christopher moved closer, his eyes searching hers. Then tell me what happened that night. Why did you leave? Emma took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as if grounding herself. The accident, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't remember much of it, just flashes, lights, glass shattering, the sound of metal twisting. I woke up in a hospital bed days later, miles away from where it happened. She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor. I didn't even know who I was at first. They said I was lucky to be alive, but my memory was gone for months. I didn't even remember your name. Christopher's expression softened, though tension remained in his posture. Emma's voice wavered as she continued. Then pieces started coming back. I remembered you. Everything. But before I could figure out what to do, she added, her voice trembling, someone came to the hospital, a man I didn't recognize. He told me to disappear. He said if I tried to contact you, or anyone from my old life, we'd both be in danger. Christopher's brows furrowed. Danger? From who? I don't know, Emma admitted, her voice breaking. But he knew things about you, about your family. He said they wouldn't hesitate to hurt us if I stayed. I believed him, Christopher. I was terrified. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair as he processed her words. So you just left? Without questioning it? Without trying to come to me? I didn't have a choice. Emma's voice rose, and tears streamed down her face. I was alone, confused, and scared. By the time I thought about coming back, too much time had passed. I thought maybe you'd moved on. Maybe it was better this way. Christopher let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Better? You thought it was better to let me believe you were dead. Emma looked away, guilt lining her face. I didn't know what else to do. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The silence hung heavily in the air, only broken by the distant sounds of the city outside. Finally, Christopher sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. This doesn't make any sense, he muttered. Who would want to keep us apart? And why? Emma hesitated, her voice trembling as she spoke. You know your family has enemies, Christopher. Powerful ones. Maybe it was them. Christopher looked up, his jaw tightening. If someone thought they could control me by taking you away, they were wrong. But if this is about my family, I'll find out. Emma crossed her arms, her expression conflicted. You don't have to get involved. The past is better left buried. Not when it's been a lie, he shot back. Not when it cost me 12 years of my life. She sighed, sitting down on the armrest of a chair across from him. What are you going to do? I'm going to get to the bottom of this, Christopher said firmly. And I'm going to protect you, Emma. I lost you once. I'm not going to lose you again. His words sent a chill through Emma, both comforting and unsettling. She had spent years building walls around her heart, convincing herself that what they had was nothing more than a thing of the past. But now, hearing the unwavering conviction in his voice, those walls began to crack. Christopher, she started, but he interrupted her. Promise me you'll stay here, he urged, his tone soft but desperate. Don't go back to the restaurant. Don't go anywhere until I figure this out. Can you do that? She hesitated, torn between the instinct to run and the pull to trust him. Finally, she nodded. Okay. He stood, his expression softening as he looked at her. Thank you. Without another word, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Emma stared at the empty space where he had stood, her heart weighed down by everything that had gone unsaid. She wanted to believe that Christopher could fix this, that he could protect her. But the fear that had kept her hidden for so long still lingered. She wasn't sure if love alone could conquer the shadows of their past. Christopher sat in his car, engine idling, his gaze fixed on the street ahead. Emma's words echoed in his mind. I was terrified. Someone knew things about you, about your family. The gnawing feeling in his gut only deepened. Something darker was at play, something he had been blind to for far too long. His family's influence stretched far and wide, but who would go to such extremes to tear him and Emma apart? His phone buzzed on the console, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up to find a text from Detective Maxwell Barnes, a trusted investigator he had called on before. Maxwell, meet me at my office. I found something you'll want to see. Without a second thought, Christopher shifted into gear and drove to Maxwell's modest office on the edge of Manhattan. Maxwell was known for being thorough and discreet, both crucial when dealing with anything involving the Langston family. Inside the small office, the hum of a ceiling fan filled the otherwise quiet room. Maxwell, a grizzled man in his late 50s, sat behind a desk cluttered with papers and half-empty coffee cups. He waved for Christopher to sit. I ran a preliminary background check on Emma, like you asked, Maxwell said, sliding a thin file across the desk. She's got almost no history, Maxwell continued. Too little for someone who's supposedly been living and working in New York for years. Christopher opened the file, scanning the few details it contained. She said she was forced to disappear after the accident, he muttered. Maxwell nodded, lighting a cigarette. That tracks with what I found, or, rather, what I didn't find. No tax records, no credit history until about 3 years ago. It's like she didn't even exist before then. Christopher's jaw tightened. Do you think she's lying? Maxwell exhaled a cloud of smoke, his sharp eyes meeting Christopher's. I don't think so, but someone's been cleaning up after her, and not very subtly. Whoever they are, they're sloppy, but they're dangerous. Christopher leaned forward, his voice low. She mentioned threats against both of us. Is there any connection to my family? Maxwell smirked grimly. Isn't there always? He pulled out another sheet of paper, laying it down on the desk. I found this in an old police report from around the time of Emma's accident. A witness claimed they saw a black SUV parked near the crash site, but no one ever followed up. Guess who owned the car? Christopher's stomach twisted. Langston Corporation. Maxwell nodded. Your father's name is all over the original registration. Officially, it was reported stolen a week before the accident, but it's too convenient to ignore. A cold wave of realization washed over Christopher. His father, Charles Langston, had always been ruthless in business, willing to cross any line to protect the family empire. But orchestrating an accident to threaten Emma? The idea was unthinkable. Yet, with each new piece of evidence, it seemed more and more plausible. Does my father know you're looking into this? Christopher asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Not yet, Maxwell replied, stubbing out his cigarette. But if he's involved, he'll find out soon enough. Men like Charles Langston don't stay in the dark for long. Christopher clenched his fists. I need proof, solid proof. that ties him to this. Maxwell raised an eyebrow. And when you get it, what then? Christopher didn't answer immediately. His mind raced with conflicting emotions. Anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming need for justice. Finally, he spoke, his voice resolute. I'll decide when the time comes. For now, keep digging. I'll pay whatever it takes. Maxwell nodded, his expression unreadable. You're the boss. Meanwhile, back at Emma's apartment, she sat nervously by the window, her eyes scanning the street below. Christopher's insistence that she stay put had shaken her. It had been years since she had felt truly safe, and the thought of being found again filled her with dread. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, making her jump. She picked it up and saw a message from Eleanor, her coworker at the restaurant. Eleanor. Hey, where are you? The manager's freaking out that you didn't show up. You okay? Emma hesitated before typing a reply. I'm fine. Just needed a day. Can you cover for me? A moment later, Eleanor responded. Sure. But you owe me. Let me know if you need anything. Emma set the phone down with a sigh. She appreciated Eleanor's help but knew she couldn't tell her the real reason for her absence. Not yet. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her door. She froze, her breath catching as the steps grew louder. Then they stopped directly in front of her apartment. There was a brief pause, followed by a soft knock. Emma, a familiar voice called. It's me, Eleanor. Relief flooded her as she opened the door. Eleanor stood there with a concerned look on her face, holding a bag of takeout. You didn't sound like yourself earlier, so I brought you something, Eleanor said, stepping inside. What's going on? Emma forced a smile as she took the bag. It's nothing, just a lot on my mind. Eleanor studied her for a moment, her expression softening. Well, if you need to talk, you know where to find me. Thanks, Eleanor, Emma said quietly, truly meaning it. As Eleanor left, Emma closed the door behind her and leaned against it, clutching the bag tightly. For the first time in years, she felt the walls closing in. The secrets she had buried so deep were clawing their way to the surface, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to face them. Christopher stood in his penthouse, staring out at the city below. The weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders. If his father was involved, it meant the betrayal ran deeper than he could have imagined. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. I'll protect her, he murmured to himself, no matter what it takes. The next morning, Christopher sat in his office, his eyes fixed on a framed photo on his desk. An old photograph sat on his desk. It showed his family. His younger self, his father Charles, and his mother, who had passed years ago. The smiles frozen in time felt empty now. After what Maxwell had uncovered, the notion that his father could have been the mastermind behind the accident that had torn Emma from his life felt like a gut punch. The sound of his intercom buzzing pulled him out of his spiraling thoughts. Mr. Langston, Maria's voice echoed through the speaker. Mr. Barnes is here to see you. Send him in, Christopher replied, his voice tight, forcing himself to sit up straighter. Maxwell entered a moment later, carrying a thick folder that looked even more packed than the last one. I've got more for you, Maxwell said as he dropped the folder on the desk with a heavy thud. But it's uglier than the last batch. Christopher opened it without hesitation, his eyes scanning the new evidence. Surveillance photos, financial transactions, and more unsettling details about the Langston Corporation's shady dealings filled the pages. One document stood out. It was a transfer of funds made just days before Emma's accident, funneled through one of his father's shell companies. The recipient, an offshore account under a fake name. This shows he was paying someone, Christopher muttered, his stomach sinking. But who? I'm still digging, Maxwell replied. But look at this. He handed Christopher another sheet of paper. It was a flagged email that sent a chill down his spine. The message contained a chilling order. Make sure she's gone. No loose ends. Christopher's hands balled into fists as he read the words. He really did it, he murmured, the weight of the realization settling in. He ordered the accident. Maxwell leaned back, lighting another cigarette. Looks like it. But if you want to make this public, you'll need more solid evidence. Right now, all of this is circumstantial. Christopher slammed the folder shut, his mind racing. I'm confronting him. He's not getting away with this. Maxwell raised an eyebrow. Are you sure that's the best move? Guys like your father don't like being backed into a corner. I don't care, Christopher said with a cold edge to his voice. He's hurt enough people, and I won't let him hurt Emma again. Meanwhile, Emma sat in her apartment, the walls closing in around her. Christopher had insisted she stay put for her own safety, but the isolation felt like a cage. She stared at her phone, hesitating over whether or not to reach out to him, when another message from Eleanor popped up. Eleanor. Hey, just heard something weird. Some guy was asking about you at the restaurant. Said he was a friend of yours. Emma's stomach turned. She quickly typed back. Emma. What did he look like? Eleanor. Tall, dark suit. Kinda intimidating. Didn't leave a name. Should I be worried? Emma's fingers shook as she typed her reply. Emma. If he comes back, don't tell him anything about me. Please. She set the phone down, her pulse racing. She didn't have to guess who the man might have been. He was a reminder that the dangers she had run from weren't just a thing of the past. They were still very real. She needed to warn Christopher, and fast. Later that afternoon, Christopher found himself at his father's estate. The mansion, grand and imposing, felt suffocating today. The pristine lawns and towering columns no longer seemed like symbols of power, but rather an eerie reminder of the cold legacy his father had built. He entered the study to find Charles sitting behind his massive oak desk. The older man looked up at him, a faint smile on his lips. Christopher, he greeted, his voice smooth. To what do I owe this pleasure? Christopher wasted no time with pleasantries. He slammed the folder onto the desk, papers spilling out. You owe me an explanation. Charles raised an eyebrow, glancing at the documents. And what exactly am I supposed to explain? Don't play dumb, Christopher snapped, his voice sharp. The shell companies, the transfers, the emails you orchestrated. The accident that almost killed Emma and tore her from my life. Charles leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. You've been busy, he said calmly. But be careful. Throwing around accusations like that can have consequences. Christopher's anger flared. You're not denying it. Charles sighed, standing up and walking toward the window. Everything I've done has been to protect this family, to ensure your future, to safeguard our legacy. Protect me, Christopher spat, his voice rising. You call destroying my life protection? You took everything from me. Charles turned to face him, his gaze icy. Emma was a distraction. She was never going to be a part of our world. I did what needed to be done to ensure you had a future worth living for. Christopher stared at him in disbelief. You thought destroying my life and hers was the way to do that? To control everything? Charles shrugged, unmoved. One day you'll understand. Everything I've built will be yours. I don't want it, Christopher hissed. Not like this. The room fell into a heavy silence. And finally, Christopher's voice cut through the tension. Stay away from Emma. If you even think about interfering with her again, I'll make sure the whole world knows what you've done. Charles smirked, leaning back in his chair with a defiant air. You're just like your mother. Soft, weak. You don't have the stomach to take me down. Christopher stepped closer, his eyes burning with fury. Try me. Without another word, he turned and left, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on him. Outside, he pulled out his phone and dialed Maxwell. It's him, Christopher said as soon as the detective picked up. I need everything you've got. I'm taking him down. Back in her apartment, Emma paced back and forth, her nerves on edge. She had finally sent Christopher a message. Someone's looking for me. I'm scared. Her phone buzzed seconds later, his reply immediate. I'm on my way. Christopher arrived at her building within minutes, his car screeching to a halt in front. He stepped out, scanning the street with sharp, calculating eyes. His earlier confrontation with his father still weighed heavily on him, But Emma's message shifted his focus entirely to her safety. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding, not from exertion, but from the urgency of the moment. When he reached her door, he knocked twice, his voice calm but firm. "Emma? It's me." The door opened cautiously, the chain still latched, allowing Emma to peek through the gap. Relief flooded her when she saw him, and she quickly unlocked the door, letting him in. "Did anyone follow you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "No," Christopher reassured her, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "But we need to talk." "What happened?" Christopher asked, his voice full of concern as he watched Emma pace the small living room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Emma hesitated, gathering her thoughts. She stopped and glanced toward the window, her mind clouded with fear. "Eleanor texted me earlier," she started, her voice tight. "She said a man came by the restaurant asking about me. He didn't give a name, but she described him as tall, intimidating, and way too interested." Christopher's jaw tightened as the weight of her words sank in. "That's no coincidence," he muttered under his breath. "Whoever he is, he's tied to my father." His eyes burned with a mix of anger and determination. "I confronted him today." Emma froze mid-step, her gaze snapping to him in disbelief. "You what?" "I had to," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "He's behind all of this, the accident, the threats, the years we've lost. I couldn't sit back and do nothing." Her face paled, and she sank into the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. "Christopher, you don't understand what he's capable of. He doesn't just make threats, he follows through. He doesn't hesitate." "I know exactly what he's capable of," Christopher said, sitting beside her. His hand rested gently on her shoulder. "But I won't let him hurt you again. Not now, not ever." Emma shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't get it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The last time someone tried to protect me, they disappeared. I can't lose you too." Christopher reached for her hands, his grip steady and reassuring. "Emma," he said softly, "listen to me. I've already lost you once. I won't let it happen again. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Her heart twisted as she looked at him, but fear continued to cloud her thoughts. "And what if he comes after you next? What if he ruins your career? He's not above destroying everything to keep his secrets buried." Christopher's expression hardened. "Let him try," he replied, his voice low with determination. "I'm not afraid of him." As night fell, the apartment seemed to grow quieter, almost unnervingly so. Christopher refused to leave, taking a post by the window with his phone in hand, reading through updates from Maxwell. Emma, curled up on the couch, stared blankly at the coffee table in front of her. After a long silence, Emma broke it with a question, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever regret it?" Christopher looked up, confused. "Regret what?" "Us," she said softly, her gaze drifting to her hands. "Loving me, knowing how much it's cost you." His expression softened immediately, and he walked over to sit beside her. "Never," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Emma. Losing you, that was the hardest thing I've ever gone through. If anything, I regret not fighting harder to find out the truth sooner." Emma blinked back tears, her walls crumbling with his words. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting you by staying away." "You were protecting me?" Christopher reassured her, gently taking her hand. "But now it's my turn to protect you." Before they could say anything more, a sharp knock at the door cut through the moment, both of them freezing, a shared sense of apprehension passing between them. Christopher motioned for Emma to stay put as he moved toward the door. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice steady, but with an edge of caution. "It's Eleanor," came the reply, her voice muffled but familiar. Christopher glanced back at Emma, who nodded cautiously. He opened the door just enough to let Eleanor step inside. She looked around, her usual bright demeanor replaced with unease. She fidgeted with her bag as she stepped in. Sorry to show up unannounced, Eleanor said, her voice a little shaky. But I thought you should know the guy who was asking about you. He came back. Emma's breath hitched, her heart racing. What? What did he say? Eleanor paused, glancing at Christopher before continuing. He wasn't asking questions this time. He just watched. He sat at the bar for over an hour, barely talking to anyone. Then, before he left, he asked if you'd be working tomorrow. Christopher's fists clenched, a surge of protective instinct flooding through him. Did you tell him anything? Of course not, Eleanor said quickly. But it was creepy. I thought you should know. Emma sank deeper into the couch, the dread she had tried to keep at bay creeping ever closer to the surface. Christopher, however, stood tall, his voice firm as he looked at Eleanor. Thank you, Eleanor, he said, his tone resolute. You did the right thing coming here. Let me handle this. Eleanor nodded, casting a worried glance at Emma. Just be careful, okay? After she left, Christopher turned back to Emma, his gaze filled with determination. This isn't a coincidence. Whoever that man is, he's working for my father. Emma's voice was barely a whisper, filled with fear and uncertainty. What are we going to do? Christopher knelt down in front of her, his hands resting gently on her knees. We're going to stop running, he said, his tone unwavering. If he wants a fight, I'll give him one. But we're not hiding anymore. Emma looked into his eyes, her fear warring with the trust she had always placed in him. Finally, she nodded, her voice trembling but resolute. Okay. Far from them, in the shadows of Charles Langston's sprawling estate, the man from the restaurant reported back. His voice was calm, but his words carried an ominous weight. She knows, he said simply. Charles's voice crackled through the line, cold, deliberate. Then it's time to make her disappear again. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the blinds in Emma's apartment, casting a warm glow over the room, Christopher sat by the window. His phone rested in one hand while he sipped his coffee with the other. Across the room, Emma slept soundly on the couch, her face peaceful despite the chaos that surrounded them. Christopher's phone buzzed, pulling his attention away from the momentary calm. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Maxwell. Meet me at my office. I've got something big. He stood, moving quietly toward the door, careful not to wake Emma. Just as his hand touched the knob, her voice broke the silence. Where are you going? She asked groggily, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. Maxwell's name brought him back to the moment. He has something for me, Christopher replied. I'll be back soon. Emma frowned, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Are you sure it's safe? After what Eleanor told us. I'll be fine, Christopher said, his tone reassuring. Maxwell's office is secure. I won't let anyone follow me. Emma hesitated, her lip trembling. Just be careful. He nodded, giving her a small smile. I will. Lock the door behind me, and don't open it for anyone but me. She nodded reluctantly, watching him leave. Maxwell's office felt quieter than usual when Christopher arrived. Papers and photos were spread out in disarray across the desk. Maxwell gestured for Christopher to sit as he handed over a new file. This, Maxwell said, leaning back in his chair, is the missing piece you've been looking for. Christopher opened the file and scanned its contents. Bank statements, flight records, surveillance photos, all linking his father, Charles Langston, to the man who had been asking about Emma. This guy, Maxwell said, pointing to a photo of a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit. His name's Victor Morales, ex-military, now working as a private contractor. He's not just watching Emma. He's been tracking her movements for months. Christopher's grip on the folder tightened. So my father hired him. Exactly, Maxwell confirmed. Morales is one of the best at what he does. But even the best leave traces. I found payments from one of your father's shell companies to Morales's offshore account, dating back to before Emma even resurfaced. Christopher's eyes blazed with fury. He had been scheming for months. But why? What was he so terrified of? Maxwell leaned in, lowering his voice. It's not just about keeping Emma away from you. There's something much larger at play here. Something your father is desperate to keep hidden. Christopher's jaw clenched. What is it? Maxwell sighed. I'm still putting the pieces together, but it all seems to trace back to that accident 12 years ago. I dug deeper into the official files, and here's the thing. There's no record of Emma's car being towed or checked afterward. It's as if the crash was staged. The room went silent, the weight of Maxwell's words settling heavily in the air. Christopher's fists tightened as his thoughts raced. If the accident had been a setup, it meant his father's betrayal was far worse than he ever imagined. I need more proof, Christopher said at last, his voice icy. Something that will expose him once and for all. Maxwell gave a nod. I've got a lead. There's a storage unit rented under an alias connected to your father. It could hold the evidence you're looking for. Christopher stood up, determination written all over his face. Let's go. We'll head to Emma's place. Meanwhile, Emma paced restlessly, glancing at her phone every few minutes. Christopher had been gone longer than she expected, and with each passing second, her anxiety mounted. Her phone buzzed, and she grabbed it quickly, hoping it was a message from Christopher. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. You're not safe. He knows where you are. Her heart raced as she stared at the screen. She quickly typed a response. Who is this? No reply came. Emma's hands shook as she weighed her options. She couldn't call Christopher. What if he was in danger too? But staying where she was felt just as risky. A loud knock at the door made her jump. She froze, her mind racing. Was it Christopher? Or someone else? Emma? It's me. A familiar voice broke the tension. Relief flooded through her as she rushed to open the door. Christopher walked in, his expression serious but calm. We need to move, he said. What happened? Emma asked, grabbing her bag without hesitation. Maxwell found proof, Christopher explained in a low voice. My father has been pulling the strings behind everything, from the accident to Morales tracking you. But now that we're onto him, he'll escalate. Emma's face drained of color. What do we do now? Christopher placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his eyes unwavering. We're taking him down. But first, I need to get you somewhere safe. The drive to the safe house was quiet, the air thick with tension. Christopher took them to a small, unremarkable cabin on the outskirts of the city, a place Maxwell had arranged. It wasn't the kind of luxury Emma was used to in Christopher's world, but there was a sense of security as they stepped inside. Emma looked at him. How do you know this will work? That we can stop him? Christopher hesitated, his own doubts gnawing at him, but he pushed them away, meeting her gaze. Because I won't stop until it's done. Emma nodded, though the fear still lingered in her eyes. I can't lose you again, Christopher. You won't, he promised firmly. Not this time. Meanwhile, far away, Charles Langston paced restlessly in his study, his face grim. Victor Morales stood nearby, silently awaiting orders. They're getting too close, Charles muttered, his voice low. I want them silenced. For good. Morales gave a single nod. Consider it done. As the room fell into silence, Charles gazed out the window, unease flickering across his face. For the first time in years, he felt a small crack in the control he had always maintained, and he didn't like it. Back at the safe house, the quiet was only broken by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their steps. Emma sat on the worn couch, hugging her knees to her chest, while Christopher stood near the window, his eyes scanning the dark forest that surrounded them. The tension was palpable. How long do we have to stay here? Emma asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Not long, Christopher replied, his gaze fixed on the tree line. Maxwell's working on securing the evidence. Once we have it, this will all be over. Emma didn't respond, but the fear on her face said everything. Christopher turned to her, his expression softening. I won't let anything happen to you. Trust me. She nodded, though the anxiety still gripped her chest. Just as she opened her mouth to respond, Christopher's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was Maxwell. Go ahead, Christopher said, answering the call. I found the storage unit. Maxwell's voice came through urgently. It's worse than we thought. I need you to come here alone. I'll text you the address. Christopher's brow furrowed. Why alone? Maxwell hesitated. It's sensitive. The fewer people involved, the better. Just get here as soon as you can. Something twisted in Christopher's gut. But he agreed. I'm on my way. Ending the call, he turned to Emma. I have to meet Maxwell. Stay here, lock the doors, and don't let anyone in. Emma's brow furrowed. You're leaving me here alone? It's safer this way, Christopher reassured her. I'll be back soon. Just stay hidden. Reluctantly, Emma nodded. Be careful. The storage facility was tucked away in an industrial area on the edge of the city. Christopher parked his car and stepped out into the crisp night air. The facility was eerily still, with only the faint hum of streetlights to break the silence. Maxwell was standing near the entrance, his face partially hidden in the dim light. He motioned for Christopher to follow. They walked through narrow aisles until Maxwell stopped in front of a unit. He unlocked the door and slid it open, revealing rows of shelves filled with files, boxes, and digital storage devices. This is it, Maxwell said, stepping inside. Everything your father has been hiding. Christopher followed him, scanning the shelves. What did you find? Maxwell pulled a folder from the top shelf and handed it to Christopher. This, he said, is proof that your father not only set up the accident, but has been manipulating key figures to keep Emma hidden. Bribes, threats, everything. Christopher flipped through the folder, his stomach turning as he processed the incriminating evidence. This is enough to bring him down, he said, his voice low. Maxwell hesitated. There's more. Christopher looked up, brow furrowed. What do you mean? Maxwell nodded toward a small locked box on the bottom shelf. That box contains recordings of conversations between your father and Victor Morales. The evidence confirmed what they feared. Morales had been hired to track Emma and eliminate her if necessary. A chill ran through Christopher as the words sank in. Eliminate her? Maxwell nodded solemnly. Your father isn't just trying to protect his secrets. He's going to great lengths to make sure those secrets die with her. Christopher's grip on the folder tightened, his anger rising. We need to get this to the authorities. Maxwell's face darkened. There's a problem, he said, his voice dropping. What kind of problem? Maxwell took a step closer, his voice lowering even further. Your father knows I've been helping you. He already sent someone after me. If we're going to pull this off, we have to act fast. Christopher nodded. Then we move tonight. I'll make the call. But just as he reached for his phone, the door to the storage unit slammed shut behind them. Christopher and Maxwell turned, startled, to see Victor Morales standing in the shadows, his imposing figure blocking the exit. Going somewhere? Morales asked, his voice calm yet filled with a menacing edge. Christopher stepped forward, his posture rigid. Get out of my way. Morales smirked, shaking his head. You think this ends with a few files and recordings? Your father owns this city. You'll never get close to him. Watch me. Christopher shot back, before Morales could say another word. Without hesitation, Maxwell lunged at Morales, catching him off guard. The two men collided, crashing into shelves as Christopher scrambled to grab the folder and the box. Papers and storage devices spilled across the floor in chaos. Run! Maxwell shouted, his voice strained. Christopher hesitated, torn between helping Maxwell and escaping with the evidence. But Maxwell's desperate look left him no choice. Clutching the items, Christopher bolted for the exit, his footsteps echoing through the empty facility. Back at the safe house, Emma paced restlessly, her mind spiraling with worst-case scenarios. The sudden knock at the door made her jump, her heart hammering in her chest. Who is it? She called out, her voice shaky. It's Eleanor, came the reply. Emma froze. Eleanor wasn't supposed to be here. Unease twisted in her stomach, but she cautiously approached the door. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. I came to check on you. Eleanor's voice was casual. but there was something in her tone that felt off. "Christopher called me. He wanted me to make sure you were okay." Emma's hand hovered over the lock, her instincts screaming at her not to open the door. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, a knot forming in her chest. There was a pause before Eleanor's voice grew colder, more menacing. "Open the door, Emma." Emma stepped back, her blood running cold. The warmth in Eleanor's voice had vanished, replaced by something sharp and threatening. "You're not Eleanor," Emma whispered, realizing the danger too late. The door rattled as someone outside tried to force it open. Panic surged through Emma. She grabbed her phone and dialed Christopher, her hands trembling. "Emma?" His voice answered, breathless and urgent. "Someone's here?" Emma gasped, panic creeping into her voice. "They're trying to get in." "Stay hidden," Christopher ordered immediately. "I'm on my way." Grabbing a knife from the kitchen, Emma backed into a corner, her heart pounding. Whoever was outside wasn't backing down. At that moment, Christopher sped toward the safe house, his thoughts racing. Morales had escaped, and Maxwell was hurt, but there was no time to waste. The betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined, and Emma was in immediate danger. "Hold on, Emma," he muttered through gritted teeth, gripping the steering wheel tight. "I'm coming." Inside the cabin, Emma's grip tightened around the knife as her back pressed against the wall. The door shook violently under the force of someone trying to break in. Each thud sent a jolt of fear through her body, her heart racing faster with every impact. She pressed the phone to her ear, hearing Christopher's voice urgently on the other end. "I'm almost there. Just stay out of sight. Don't let them see you." Emma's breath quickened as she glanced toward the windows. The thick curtains gave her some cover, but the sense of being watched refused to leave her. The banging on the door suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed felt even more suffocating. "Christopher," she whispered. "They've stopped." "Don't move," he instructed. "They might still be out there." Emma nodded instinctively, even though he couldn't see her. She slowly moved toward the kitchen, her fingers trembling around the knife's handle. The seconds dragged on, feeling like hours, until the silence was broken by a low, muffled voice. "She's in there. Bring her out." Emma's blood ran cold. There were now multiple voices, confirming her worst fear. This wasn't some random break-in, they had come for her. She crouched low and moved toward the back of the cabin, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The sound of footsteps circled the house, followed by the unmistakable creak of a window being tested. Just as Christopher's car screeched to a halt outside, Emma knew time was running out. He jumped out of the car without a second thought, not bothering to close the door behind him. His heart raced as he dashed toward the cabin, shadows from the trees hiding his movements. But then, a dark figure stepped out of the shadows, and Christopher barely had time to react as Victor Morales blocked his path. "Going somewhere?" Morales sneered, his voice dripping with menace. Christopher's fists clenched, fury building inside him. "Get out of my way." Morales cracked his knuckles, a twisted smirk crossing his face. "Your father warned you to stay away, but you just couldn't listen. Could you? Now I have to clean up your mess." "You won't touch her," Christopher growled, shifting his stance, preparing for a fight. Morales lunged, but Christopher was ready. He dodged the first swing, countering with a punch to Morales' ribs. The larger man grunted but quickly recovered, landing a blow that sent Christopher staggering. The two men exchanged punches, the sounds of fists meeting flesh echoing through the night. "Why not come inside the cabin?" one of the men asked, his voice mocking. Emma froze at the sound of the commotion outside. Peeking through the curtains, she saw Christopher and Morales fighting near the driveway. Her heart leapt into her throat. He was outnumbered. Two more men had emerged from the shadows. Fear gripped her, but her instinct to help him fought against it. Yet as one of the men approached the back of the cabin, she realized her own danger wasn't over. She needed to act fast. Taking a deep breath, Emma slipped into the kitchen and positioned herself near the back door. The handle turned slowly, and the door creaked open as a man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Emma held her breath, waiting for the right moment. When he turned toward her, she acted on pure adrenaline. The knife cut across his arm as he yelped in pain, stumbling back. But his reflexes were quick. He lunged at her, knocking the knife from her hand and pinning her against the wall. "You're coming with me?" the man growled, tightening his grip around Emma's wrist. Fear surged through her, but it quickly shifted into sheer determination. She twisted in his grasp, slamming her knee into his stomach. He doubled over, and Emma grabbed a heavy cast-iron pan from the counter, swinging it with all her might. The impact sent him crashing to the floor, unconscious. Meanwhile, outside, Christopher was still locked in a fierce battle with Morales. Blood dripped from a cut above his brow, but he kept fighting. Morales landed a brutal blow to Christopher's side, but Christopher used the momentum to drive his shoulder into Morales's chest, taking them both to the ground. "Give it up," Morales snarled, struggling to gain the upper hand. "You can't win this." Christopher's eyes blazed with fury as he pinned Morales down. "Watch me." With a final burst of energy, Christopher landed a series of punches that left Morales dazed. But then, hearing the sound of footsteps closing in, Christopher turned to see two more men approaching. Before they could reach him, the blare of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed as a police car sped down the dirt road, followed by another. The two men hesitated, then turned and bolted into the woods. Christopher stood, gasping for breath as officers poured out of their vehicles. One of them approached. "Christopher Langston?" "Yes," Christopher replied, wiping blood from his lip. "The man inside is armed and dangerous. He works for my father, Charles Langston." The officer nodded, signaling for his team to secure the area. Inside the cabin, Emma sat against the wall, her back pressed to the floor as the unconscious man was dragged out by police. Christopher entered shortly after, his face battered, but his expression softened when he saw her. "Are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Emma nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm fine. What about you?" "I've had worse," he said with a wry smile, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's over now. You're safe." Emma shook her head, her voice trembling. "Not yet. Not until he's gone." Christopher's jaw tightened. "He will be. I promise." As the officers secured the scene and took statements, Christopher and Emma sat side by side, their hands intertwined for the first time in years. They felt a flicker of hope, but deep down, Christopher knew the battle wasn't over. Not yet. Later, Christopher stared out the window of Maxwell's downtown office, watching the glowing skyline. His reflection seemed worn, exhausted from the events of the past few days. The weight of his father's betrayal, the near-death encounters, and the constant pressure seemed to press down on him. But now, with the final pieces of evidence Maxwell had uncovered, he knew it was time to bring Charles Langston's reign of control to an end. "You're sure about this?" Maxwell asked from behind his desk, his tone cautious. The desk was covered with evidence, bank transfers, surveillance footage, and recordings, a web of corruption, each thread leading back to Charles. Christopher nodded, his jaw set in determination. "It's time," Maxwell sighed, exhaling slowly.
"I've contacted a reporter."
"I trust she's willing to break the story, but once this goes public, there's no turning back." "Your father won't go down without a fight," Maxwell warned. Christopher's lips tightened into a grim line. "He's already lost. He just doesn't know it yet." Maxwell slid a USB drive across the desk. "This has everything, the recordings, the financial trails, the connections to Morales. Take it to her and make sure it gets out." Christopher pocketed the drive but paused. "Before this hits the press, I need to confront him face to face." Maxwell's eyes widened. "That's a dangerous move. If he feels cornered, there's no telling what he might do." "I have to," Christopher said firmly. "This isn't just about exposing him. It's about making sure he can't hurt Emma or anyone else ever again." Maxwell studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Just be careful." Christopher entered the Langston estate for what he knew would be the final time. The air inside was heavy with the smell of aged wood and wealth, but now the grandeur felt hollow. Each step toward his father's study felt like walking into a battlefield. Charles sat behind his massive oak desk, his expression unreadable. He looked up slowly, his sharp eyes narrowing as if sensing what was about to unfold. "Christopher," Charles said coolly, leaning back in his chair, "I wasn't expecting you." Christopher shut the door behind him, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. He walked forward, placing the USB drive on the desk. "I think you'll want to see this." Charles raised an eyebrow but didn't move to take it. "What's this supposed to be?" "Proof. Of everything," Christopher said, his voice steady. "Of the accident you staged, the threats, the bribes. Everything you did to keep me out of my life and protect your precious empire." Charles's expression darkened, but he remained composed. "You've been busy. You don't even deny it," Christopher said, his fists clenching. "You destroyed lives. Her life, my life, all to keep your secrets." Charles leaned forward, his tone cold. "You think you understand the choices I made? The sacrifices? Everything I did was for you, for this family, to protect what's ours." Christopher's voice rose, anger lacing his words. "Protecting the family doesn't mean tearing it apart. You didn't protect me, you controlled me. You decided who I could love, who I could trust. And now you've ruined everything." Charles stood, his imposing figure casting a long shadow. "You're naive, Christopher. You think love is enough? That you can build a life on sentiment? This world doesn't work that way." "I'm done living in your world," Christopher shot back. "And I'm done letting you hurt the people I care about." Charles smirked, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "And what do you plan to do? Destroy me? You don't have the stomach for it." Christopher stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Watch me." He turned to leave, but Charles's voice stopped him in his tracks. "If you go through with this, you're no longer my son." Christopher turned back, meeting his father's gaze. "If being your son means becoming like you, I'm glad to walk away." Charles's face twitched, the mask of control slipping for just a moment. But before he could respond, Christopher was already gone. Hours later, the story broke. Every major news outlet carried the explosive revelation. Charles Langston, a titan of industry, was implicated in a massive scandal involving staged accidents, corruption, and coercion. The evidence was irrefutable, and the media frenzy was relentless. At the safe house, Emma sat watching the coverage, her emotions a mix of relief and disbelief. Christopher sat beside her, his hand gently covering hers. "It's over," he said softly. "He can't hurt you anymore." Emma nodded, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "What about you? What happens now?" Christopher leaned back, exhaling deeply. "I don't know. The Langston name is ruined, and I'm fine with that. I just want a fresh start. For both of us." She turned to him, her voice trembling. "You gave up everything?" "No," Christopher said firmly, his eyes locking onto hers. "I've gained everything that actually matters." Before Emma could respond, her phone vibrated in her hand. She glanced down, her face draining of color. "It's Maxwell," she murmured, quickly answering the call. "Emma, are you with Christopher right now?" Maxwell's voice came through, urgent. "Yes, why?" she asked, anxiety creeping in. "There's a situation," Maxwell said, his tone grim. "Morales hasn't disappeared. He's still out there, and he's not finished yet." As the weight of Maxwell's warning settled over Emma, miles away in a dim, sterile room, Morales stood over a large map spread out on the table. A photo of Christopher and Emma was pinned at its center, a knife stabbed through the image. Charles's voice crackled over a speakerphone nearby. "Do what you need to do. This ends today." Morales's smirk was chilling as he spoke. "Consider it done." Back at the safe house, the morning air felt oppressive. Christopher stood by the window, staring out at the silent, sprawling woods beyond. Even though the public collapse of his father's empire had made waves, the looming threat of Morales still clung to the air. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, especially not with Emma still in danger. Emma walked into the room, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She set one down on the table next to him and studied his tense form. "You haven't slept, have you?" she asked quietly. Christopher gave a small nod, still gazing out at the tree line. "I can't afford to relax. Not while Morales is still out there." Emma moved closer, her hand gently resting on his arm, offering comfort. "You've already done so much, Christopher. You exposed your father for the world to see. You protected me. Maybe it's time to let someone else carry the weight of the fight." His expression softened as he turned to face her. "I can't risk that, Emma. Not when it comes to you." Just then, Maxwell's car kicked up a cloud of dust as it pulled into the driveway. Christopher opened the door before Maxwell even had a chance to knock. "Tell me you have good news," Christopher said, his voice edged with impatience. Maxwell stepped inside, fatigue clearly evident in his face, though his eyes were sharp with focus. "Good news, but also bad. We've located Morales. He's hiding out in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city." "And the bad news?" Christopher asked, already sensing the danger. Maxwell hesitated, his expression darkening. "He's not alone. He's got a crew with him and they're armed. He won't surrender without a fight." Christopher's jaw tightened. "Then we bring the fight to him." Emma's face turned pale. "Christopher, you can't be serious." "I am," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "This ends today." The warehouse stood like a looming shadow on the edge of the city, its rusted metal and shattered windows creating an imposing silhouette. Christopher and Maxwell crouched behind a stack of crates, carefully scanning the area. Maxwell's team, a small but skilled group of officers, had secured the perimeter, ready to move at a moment's notice. Inside, Morales paced the room with an air of frustration. His crew scattered around, weapons visible and at the ready. "He'll come," Morales muttered under his breath, his eyes locked on the door. "He won't leave her unguarded." Christopher's voice sliced through the tension as he stepped boldly into the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the faint light in the room. "You're right. I won't." Morales turned to face him, a twisted smirk tugging at his lips. "Langston, brave of you to show up alone." Christopher took another step forward, his gaze unwavering. "You want me? Here I am. Let her go." Morales laughed, his fingers grazing the gun holstered at his hip. "You really think this is about her? This is about you. Your family destroyed mine. This is payback." Christopher's anger simmered beneath the surface, his voice steady. "You're nothing more than a pawn in my father's game. You think this will bring you justice? It won't. All it will do is make you just like him." Morales raised his weapon, but before he could pull the trigger, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Maxwell's team burst in, guns drawn, shouting orders. Chaos erupted in an instant. Morales's men fought back, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the surprise assault. Christopher seized the moment, lunging at Morales and tackling him to the ground. The 2 men struggled fiercely, each fighting for control. Morales threw Christopher off, reaching for his gun, but before he could get a shot off, a gunshot rang out. Maxwell stood behind him, the barrel of his weapon steady. Morales collapsed, clutching his shoulder, groaning in pain. "It's over," Maxwell said, his voice flat and final. "You're finished." Hours later, back at the safe house, Christopher and Emma sat on the porch, a heavy silence between them. The weight of the ordeal had lifted, but they knew the battle wasn't just physical. It was emotional, too. News of Morales's capture spread like wildfire, and the downfall of the Langston Empire was now official. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter, less charged. Emma leaned against Christopher, her head resting on his shoulder, a sense of peace settling over her. "It's really over, isn't it?" she asked, her voice small. Christopher nodded, his arm wrapping around her protectively. "It is." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and cautious hope. "What now?" Christopher smiled, his expression soft but full of resolve. "Now we start fresh. No more running. No more hiding. Just us. Emma's lips curved into a smile, her heart swelling with the promise of a new beginning, one that didn't carry the weight of the past. At the same time, far from their new hope, Charles Langston sat alone in his sprawling, now empty estate. The once great mansion, filled with memories of a life he built on manipulation and lies, now echoed with nothing but the silence of defeat. The empire he'd worked so hard to create was in ruins, and his only son had turned against him. Staring at the news on his phone, he felt the full weight of his decisions crashing down on him. For the first time, Charles Langston knew the consequences of his actions, and he had no one to blame but himself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Christopher and Emma stood together, hand in hand, watching as the world around them settled into a peaceful quiet. They had fought for their future, faced down unimaginable challenges, and emerged stronger than ever. For the first time in years, they felt free.